In this program, we are going to look at some applications of the statistical tools you have studied in the past few weeks. We are going to focus our attention on applications from economic history. It might surprise you to learn that statistical evidence can play a central role in historical research. When we think about what historians do, we probably think of people reading government and military documents or maybe diaries and letters in order to put together stories about prominent politicians, soldiers, or scientists. While there are certainly many historians who do that sort of work, there are others who focus on the stories of the great mass of people, common folks, poor folks, as well as the wealthy and prominent, who do so using quantitative evidence. Economic historians in particular often use quantitative data and statistical methods combined with economic models to examine things like economic growth, the transition from agriculture to industry, the labor force activity of women, and the sources of income and wealth. Obviously, economic historians and economists in general can't run laboratory experiments in order to gather data for their studies. Economists who study current events might be able to design their own surveys in order to collect the information they need. But even this route is typically closed to the economic historian. Most of the people that they want to study aren't around to answer questions. So they have to rely on data that have already been collected, usually for reasons other than those the researcher has in mind. Economic historians have identified a wide variety of useful sources of evidence for this sort of work. Probably the most important and most widely used source of data for studying U.S. economic history is the U.S. Census. Most of you are at least a little bit familiar with the census. You might know that it is a complete count of the U.S. population taken once every 10 years. You might also know that in addition to simply counting people, the census currently collects information on age, education, marital status, income, occupation, the characteristics of the house you live in, and a number of other characteristics of individuals and their living arrangements. Collecting the census every 10 years allowed the composition of the House of Representatives to be adjusted to reflect changes in population, like the growth of the states in the West. Like the U.S. population, the census itself has changed over time. The 1790 census asked just 6 questions of each household: the name of the head of the household, the number of free white males under age 16 in the household, the number of free white males over age 16, the number of free white females, the number of other free persons, and the number of slaves in the household. The result of the first census were presented in one thin volume. Over time, additional questions were added and new methods used to suit the interests of the day. As the country began to industrialize, questions about occupation were added to enable the government to track this change in economic composition. As urban poverty began to become a problem in the late 19th century, questions were added concerning disability status, whether one was receiving some form of aid to the poor, and so on. As immigration increased, questions about birthplace, parents' birthplace, and language were added. In the 20th century, the census began to track schooling levels, incomes, unemployment, and other new issues. Even if economic historians had to simply rely on the published totals from these censuses, these documents would provide a great deal of information about the development of the U.S. economy. But we can do much better than that. We can go to the original manuscripts, or at least microfilmed copies, and construct data sets based on individual responses to the census. Using this kind of information, we can examine a wide variety of topics to help us understand how Americans lived in the past and what affected their living conditions. In fact, a team at the University of Minnesota is currently collecting and editing data sets based on census manuscripts from 1850 to the present. We will use some of the products of their work in order to see how economic historians can use sources like the census, along with simple statistical tools, to study the past. As I mentioned earlier, the questions that census takers asked changed from census to census. The questions they asked suited their own purposes. They couldn't have guessed quite how we would want to use their work decades later, nor could they have imagined the computing power that we would have available for studying their data. As a result, not all the censuses contain information on topics we care about. In particular, no census before 1940 records any information on income. However, 3 censuses in the middle of the 1800s, the 1850, 1860, and 1870 censuses, ask questions about wealth. We will use these three data sets to examine wealth patterns in the U.S. at a very important time in the nation's history, a time when industry was growing, when lots of immigrants were arriving, and when the country was expanding to the West. And of course, when the Civil War was fought and slavery was finally ended in the U.S. The 1850 data set contains information on 1 out of every 100 families in the U.S. The 1860 and 1870 data sets are 1 in 500 samples. These census data sets report information on two kinds of wealth: real wealth, which is the value of any land a household owns, and personal wealth, or the value of all other assets that an individual or household might hold, including savings. Real wealth is reported in all three of these censuses, and personal wealth is reported in 1860 and 1870. As a starting point, let's just take a look at the overall mean and median values of these forms of wealth in 1850, 1860, and 1870. Here's one thing you might notice right away. It's not clear that the typical person was getting wealthier over time. Both the mean and the median levels of real wealth rose from 1850 to 1860, but mean and median real, personal, and total wealth all fell from 1860 to 1870. A second observation you might make based on these simple statistics is that the wealth distribution appears to have been quite skewed. Probably a lot of people held little wealth and a few people held very high levels of wealth. We can infer this from the fact that the wealth means are so much higher than the wealth medians. Remember that the means are affected by extreme values, while medians are simply reflecting the middle value, regardless of how great or small the wealth values at the ends of the spectrum are. Look at real wealth in 1870, for instance. The mean level of this type of wealth was $1,891, but the median level was 0, meaning that at least half of the population held no wealth of this form at all. We'll look more closely at the shape of these distributions in a minute. For now, let's focus on what's affecting the mean and median values of wealth. One thing affecting these levels might be inflation or changes in the price level, and thus the value of the dollar. When economists compare values of income or wealth at different times, they like to remove the effects of inflation in order to get a sense of comparative levels of real purchasing power. It turns out that due to inflation, you would need about $1.11 in 1860 to get what you could have bought with just $1 in 1850. And you'd need about $1.57 in 1870 to get what $1 would get you in 1850. We can use this information to convert our wealth figures into what they would have been worth in 1850, removing the effects of inflation. To convert these wealth figures to their value in terms of constant 1850 prices, we divide the 1860 values by $1.11 and divide the 1870 values by $1.57. Not surprisingly, adjusting for inflation just reinforces our sense that mean wealth was falling between 1860 and 1870. Also, looking at the means and medians side by side reinforces our sense of the shape of these distributions. In each case, a small number of very high wealth values must be pulling up the mean relative to the median. To get a better handle on what's happening, it might be useful to construct wealth measurements for a few subgroups within the U.S. We should use our knowledge of the history of the period to drive our choice of what groups to study. One obvious event that we might want to think about is the Civil War. What sort of effect might this have on our measurements? Two important ones. First, in the 1860 census, African Americans who were held as slaves were not recorded as members of the population. Rather, they appeared in the census as property. Their market value as slaves was counted as part of the personal wealth of white Southern slaveholders. The demographic characteristics of the slaves were enumerated in a separate census schedule. This is one of the uglier reminders that the census and the statistics we get from it reflect the period in which the census takers lived. By 1870, of course, the slaves had been freed. So in that census, former slaves appeared as people, though no doubt very poor ones. Their presence and their low wealth would affect the overall distribution of wealth, probably pulling down the mean and median levels. A second effect of the Civil War on our numbers is that Southern slaveholders experienced a massive loss of wealth due to the freeing of the slaves. This also drove down average wealth in 1870. So we might want to look at separate distributions for Northerners and Southerners, and for blacks and whites, especially in the South. Another important event in this era was the ongoing settlement of the Midwestern states. Land in this region was initially very cheap to acquire, but its value rose as the region was settled and as better transportation routes opened up for the shipment of farm product back to the east. This gives us another reason to follow wealth patterns separately by region, comparing the Midwest to the Northeast and the South. We'll leave the far western states, the Rocky Mountain area and the Pacific Coast, out of the analysis, since these areas were just beginning to be settled by significant numbers of people. When we examine distributions separately for each region, we do find, as we'd expect, that patterns of wealth holding and change in wealth holding were not uniform across the U.S. in this era. In 1860, Southerners held a tremendous amount of personal wealth relative to people in all other regions, and as a result, they also had high levels of total wealth. These advantages reflect the value of slaves held by Southern plantation owners. By 1870, Southerners were quite poor in terms of personal and total wealth. Their mean personal wealth fell by almost 90% during the decade. In 1870, the median value of real personal and total wealth in this region was 0. At least half the Southern population held no wealth at all. At the same time, mean personal wealth and total wealth grew, at least a little bit, in the northeastern and midwestern states. One other fact we might note in this table is that the Midwest was the only region with substantial median real wealth holding. While means were higher in the other regions, those means reflected great wealth holding by a small number of people. In the Midwest, the mean was lower, but more folks had a respectable amount of land to call their own. Why was this the case? The Midwestern economy was still based on small family farming rather than huge plantations as in the South, or the kind of mixed economy emerging in the Northeast. Midwestern land had been cheaply available for decades, allowing many people to acquire significant amounts of land and enter into farming. You can also see that the value of land holdings in the Midwest was rising relative to land holdings in the East, as the population of the Midwest grew and this region became more integrated with the rest of the country through improved transportation. We can look at these patterns even more carefully by calculating wealth separately by race and region. For simplicity, let's just consider the means. Let's use South and non-South as our regions in this case, and let's focus on the changes between 1860 and 1870. Remember that in 1860, the only African Americans who show up in our data set are the few who were not slaves. Both within and outside the South, these folks held little wealth relative to whites, though they did a little better outside the South, especially in terms of land holding. Note, though, the degree to which black wealth declined in the South between 1860 and 1870. Can we interpret this as indicating that most individual African Americans lost money over this decade? Probably not. What really happened is that many more African Americans enter the sample in 1870, having been freed by the Civil War, and these new entrants have little wealth, even relative to African Americans who are already free. So their entrance to the sample pulls down the mean. Without question, though, the typical African American was better off in 1870 than in 1860, having moved from slavery to freedom and perhaps having picked up a small amount of personal property in the meantime. So this is a case where we really need to know the historical context and the details of our sample in order to interpret the statistics. The flip side of this process is the loss of wealth, particularly personal property, among whites in the South. The personal property they lost reflects the value of their former slaves. In fact, when we analyze the sample this way, we see that just about all of the measured decline in wealth from 1860 to 1870 is related to this process of emancipation. Whites outside the South experienced small increases in both real and personal property, at least in terms of means. Blacks in the North appear to have grown a bit poorer, but this could reflect the movement of a small number of poor former slaves to the North rather than real losses of wealth among individual blacks in the North. The evidence on average measures, means, and medians has given us some insight into wealth holding in the mid-1800s. Now we want to turn to measures of the distribution of wealth. We know, based on what we have already examined, that there were probably many people who held no wealth at all and a few people who held a lot of wealth. Can we say anything more about the amount of wealth inequality? Can we say whether it was greater in some places than in others, and whether it was increasing or declining over time? To get an initial picture of the distribution of wealth in the U.S. at this time, we can use simple box plots of these distributions, which indicate the median along with the values at the first quartile and the third quartile. A couple of facts jump out at us from these simple measures. First, as we suspected, lots of people held no wealth at all. For real property in all years and for personal property and total wealth in 1870, at least 25% of household heads reported no wealth. For real wealth in 1870, the median value was 0. Half the sample or more held no real property in this year. In this graph, it's easy to see the tremendous skewness of the wealth distributions, especially for real wealth, as well as the decline in the median between 1860 and 1870 for both real and personal wealth. A second way to describe inequality in wealth holding is to look at the share of total wealth held by different portions of the distribution. The first step in this exercise is to rank everyone by the amount of wealth they held from lowest to highest. Then we can count up the total amount of wealth held by, say, the poorest 20% of wealth holders and express that as a share of all the wealth held by the population. We can do the same thing for the next group, those from the 21st to the 40th percentile, and so on. Let's look at these numbers for the distribution of total wealth in 1860 and 1870. So in 1860, the bottom 1/5 of wealth holders held about 0.04% of the total stock of wealth, and in 1870, the bottom 1/5 held no wealth at all. Looking at the top, in 1860, we see that the top 1/5 of wealth holders held a little under 82% of all wealth, while in 1870, the top 1/5 held a little over 85%. In both years, obviously, there was incredible wealth inequality. Inequality might have been a little greater in 1870 by this measure, a little less held at the bottom and a little more held at the top. This greater inequality might reflect the introduction of the freed slaves into the population census, as we discussed earlier. Still, the differences between the wealth distributions in the 2 years seem pretty small compared to the overall picture of tremendous inequality in both. While this kind of table allows us to make some comparisons, it is a somewhat clumsy indicator of inequality. It would be nice to be able to boil these figures down into one measure, an index number for the amount of inequality in the wealth distribution. Fortunately, there is such a measure. It's called a Gini coefficient. To see what a Gini coefficient measures, we can start with the simple wealth shares table that we just looked at. Let's use the numbers for 1860. Take the data on wealth shares in the first 2 columns and make one small change. Present the wealth shares in cumulative terms. The share held by the bottom 20%, the bottom 40%, and so on. So now we have the bottom 20% holding 0.04% of all wealth as before. The bottom 40% have 1.11% of all wealth. The sum of the share held by the poorest 20% and the next poorest 20%. Notice that the bottom 100% really refers to the whole population, so they must always hold 100% of all wealth. Take these figures and plot them in a graph. This kind of graph, plotting cumulative percent of population against cumulative percent of wealth held, is called a Lorenz curve. Now ask yourself, what would this graph look like if wealth was exactly evenly distributed? That is, if everyone had exactly equal amounts of wealth. In that case, any 20% of the population would hold 20% of all wealth. So our table would look like this. Don't let the bottom 20% and highest 20% terms confuse you. In this hypothetical perfect equality world, there is no bottom or top. Let's plot the cumulative wealth shares for this perfect equality case. That is, let's draw the Lorenz curve for this case. Notice what we get in the hypothetical case. Our Lorenz curve is a straight line from 0% of the population and 0% of wealth to 100% of the population and 100% of wealth. Now let's plot the Lorenz curves for the 1860 distribution and for the perfect equality case on the same graph. Notice how the 1860 curve bends away from the line of perfect equality and then comes back. The more unequal the distribution of wealth, the further the Lorenz curve will bend away from the straight line equality case. Okay, we're almost there. Look at this graph closely. Think about the triangle outlined by the perfect equality line, the bottom x-axis, and the right border of the graph. The Lorenz curve for the 1860 wealth distribution runs through the middle of this triangle. We can measure the amount of area between the perfect equality line and the 1860 Lorenz curve. If we take this area and divide it by the total area of the triangle that lies below the equality line, we get a single number telling us essentially how far the 1860 Lorenz curve deviates from perfect equality. This ratio, the area between the equality line and the Lorenz curve, divided by the area of the whole triangle, is called a Gini ratio, or a Gini coefficient. It's a convenient index of how unequal a distribution is. If the true distribution of wealth in 1860 were perfectly equal, the Lorenz curve would be identical with the line describing perfect equality. There'd be no area between them, so the Gini coefficient would be 0. So the value of the Gini coefficient for a case of perfect equality is 0. The value in the case for perfect inequality, when one individual holds all of the wealth, for example, is 1. So every distribution will have a Gini coefficient between 0 and 1. The greater the coefficient, the more unequal the distribution is. In practice, we would want to use much smaller groupings than the 20% categories we have here. In fact, we might want to plot a separate point for every individual arranged from lowest to highest. Here are the curves for total wealth in 1860 and total wealth in 1870, using a separate point for each person. This gives us smoother curves and more precise measurements. Looked at this way, it appears that while wealth holding was tremendously unequal in both 1860 and 1870, it was probably a little more unequal in 1870 than in 1860. The Lorenz curve for 1870 is a little further away from perfect equality than the Lorenz curve for 1860 is. If we calculate the Gini coefficients for these two distributions, we get a Gini of 0.79 for total wealth in 1860 and a Gini of 0.82 for total wealth in 1870. Again, both are much closer to perfect inequality than perfect equality, but the Gini for 1870 is slightly larger, indicating a little more inequality in that year. Let's use Gini coefficients on Lorenz curves to re-examine one of the other patterns we noted earlier, the observation that real wealth was more equally distributed in the Midwest than in the Northeast. Remember what the issues were. Cheap and easy access to land had allowed a large share of the population in the Midwest to acquire at least some land, while in the Northeast, the emergence of an urban industrial sector meant that there were many people who held no real estate and a few who held very valuable plots. Here are the Lorenz curves for real wealth in the Northeast and Midwest in 1860. The difference here is a little more pronounced, and it runs the way we would expect. The Lorenz curve for Midwest real wealth lies considerably closer to pure equality than does the Lorenz curve for Northeastern real wealth. When we calculate the Gini coefficients, we get a value of about 0.73 for Midwestern real wealth and about 0.82 for Northeastern real wealth. Real wealth is fairly unequally distributed in both places, but much more so in the Northeast. Lorenz curves and Gini coefficients appear a little complicated at first, but the principles are pretty easy once you get used to them. They provide us with a simple and powerful measure of inequality that allows us to compare lots of different distributions. They make it easy to track changes in inequality over time and to compare measures of inequality for different kinds of economic variables. We've looked at wealth here, but Gini coefficients are often reported for other economic measures, particularly for income. For instance, in 1996, the Gini coefficient for income in the U.S. was about 0.43. This is much lower than the Ginis we've looked at for wealth, and we do usually find that income is more equally distributed than wealth is. But on the other hand, using Gini coefficients, we can tell that inequality increased during the past couple of decades in the U.S. In 1973, the Gini for income in the U.S. was only 0.36. I hope this discussion has given you some idea of how statistical work can be used by economic historians to understand the past. The basic tools are the same as those used by other statisticians and social scientists. We look at means, medians, distributions, box plots, and other measurements. In addition to these usual tools, though, economic historians have to keep a few other things in mind. Since they don't conduct experiments themselves, and they often use records that have been collected for different purposes, they have to be very careful about interpreting their results, and they have to know something about the historical circumstances that might affect what their data show. Despite these difficulties, the increased use of statistical methods by economic historians has helped them develop a clearer picture of the world our ancestors lived in. Thank you for watching.